Murder is the ultimate crime and holds an endless fascination. In this programme, we're going to look back in the files at the case that became known as the Babes in the Wood and re-examine it with the help of a 21st century jury of experts. Psychologist and profiling expert Kerry Danes, journalist and crime novelist Hilary Bonner, retired senior police investigator Mick Turner and forensic scientist Alan Baker. What was the method? What was the motive? How was the investigation conducted? Were clues missed or deliberately ignored? Today we ask, what more could have been done to secure justice for the Babes in the Wood? We look back on the 1950s as an age of innocence, when children had the kind of freedom to roam that is often denied to modern youngsters. For the community of Stapleton in Bristol, that age of innocence came to a brutal end on a sultry midsummer evening in 1957. 7-year-old June Sheasby and her little brother Royston went out to play here in this woodland park. They were never seen alive again. After 50 years, is there someone out there who still holds a terrible secret? In 1957, in the Bristol suburb of Stapleton, on the banks of the River Frome, lived foundryman Jesse Sheasby, his wife Barbara, and their children. John, the eldest, aged 10, June, aged 7, and the baby of the family, 5-year-old Royston. For local children, the great expanse of Snuff Mills Park formed a continuous woodland corridor along the banks of the river. Here, horses grazed, dogs romped, and young imaginations ran riot. This riverbank was to be the scene on which the drama of the Sheasbys will be played out. Thursday, June the 20th, 1957, was swelteringly hot. The West Country was in the throes of a midsummer heatwave. 5-year-old Royston had just come back from school and wanted to go out again and look at a pair of horses that had recently arrived in a nearby field. His sister June was less keen to go, but young Royston persuaded her, and doubtless their mother would not have been happy for him to go out alone. It was 5:30, and after telling their mother where they were going, the children set off for the short stroll from their home in Brockworth Crescent towards Snuff Mills. An hour and a half later, at 7, Barbara, who had been busy decorating upstairs, suddenly realized the time and started looking for the children. Usually the two little ones were in bed by 7:30, even on light evenings. Neighbours joined Jessie and Barbara in an extended search of the area. As dusk began to fall at 9:15 in the evening, the distraught parents called the local police station and reported the children missing.
Police?
The hunt for the children grew as the parents' anguish increased. Tracker dogs were brought in from Dorchester. Teams of frogmen began searching the River Frome. Firemen pumped water from a pond. The whole community joined in a desperate inch-by-inch search of woods, ponds, outhouses and slag heaps within a 5-mile radius of Brockworth Crescent. By now, the whole of Britain shared in the harrowing press coverage of the lost Babes in the Wood and held its breath for news. Jessie and Barbara Sheasby never stopped hoping that their children might still be alive.
I think everyone who was in the West Country at that time remembers that case. I don't remember the details of it, but the impact I will remember for the rest of my life. One of the reasons is that television was new. It was certainly new in my household. I was 8 years old and I was sitting in my front room watching these poor people, and I will remember it for the rest of my life.
Could the pair be trapped in the wood or in one of the ravines along the banks of the River Frome? Worse still, could some sick person be holding the children against their will? An anonymous letter to the Bristol Evening Post suggested that June and Royston had indeed been kidnapped. Suddenly, almost as foreboding, the blue skies over Bristol turned black. The rain lashed down in thundery torrents as the June heatwave ended. The search effort was now severely hampered. On Monday night, July the 1st, 1957, young police constable Jefferson Brough sounded his whistle. By the light of his torch, standing near Snuffmill's Weir, he'd seen a tiny hand protruding from layers of leaves among the thick undergrowth. Rain had washed away the soil and foliage to yield up the bodies of 2 children in a shallow grave just 100 yards from the river bank. The hand was Royston's. June lay just inches away. For Barbara and June Sheasby and their surviving boy John, hope had died with the shrill blast of a police whistle. The idyllic riverbank spot became a dazzle of emergency lighting as Dr. Hunt, the Home Office pathologist, collected samples of earth to analyse for blood and other fluids. In the small hours of Tuesday, the head of Bristol CID, Detective Chief Superintendent Phillips, gave a press conference. "This is murder," he said. The impact on Stapleton was crushing. On the council estate where the Sheasbys lived, mothers escorted their children to school and fetched them home at tea time. The kidnap story had turned out to be a hoax, so it wasn't a kidnap that had gone wrong. With Jessie and Barbara Sheasby's wreath was the inscription from a heartbroken mummy and daddy, "Good night and God bless." Neighbours stood to pay their respects as the 2 small coffins were laid to rest in Stoke Lane Cemetery. But was the killer watching them in their grief?
You could never rule out that the perpetrator might come back to the crime scene, perhaps hiding himself amongst the crowds of onlookers, and certainly the police would consider some kind of surveillance or recording, but of course in the 1950s that would have been much more difficult to achieve.
Profiling, as we think of it, has only really developed since the mid-1980s. The first thing that we would think of as a profile, so the first time that a psychologist have used their skills of analysis to help police during an investigation, was the John Duffy case, the case of the railway rapist. So in 1957, the thought of inviting a psychologist to look at the police information probably would have seemed quite ludicrous.
The post-mortem, meanwhile, revealed both children had severe head injuries that had probably been inflicted with a blunt instrument. Bristol CID had little else in the way of leads. There was no evidence of a sexual assault or of a struggle or attempted theft. Despite this, Chief Superintendent Phillips concluded that it was the work of a sadist.
But in actual fact, Chief Superintendent Phillips was quite wrong. Why would it be the work of a sadist? A sadist is somebody who gains gratification from inflicting pain onto their victim. There was nothing about the injuries of the victim that suggested that they had been tortured. In actual fact, the injuries that seemed to have led to death were quite functional. 2 swift blows to the head, 1 per victim.
For the police, the major concern was the time lag of 11 days between the children's disappearance and the discovery of their bodies.
By mid-July, the police remained convinced there were scores of witnesses still to come forward.
Some were understandably reluctant. On July the 16th, police appealed to the many courting couples who were known to be sharing time together on the banks of the River Frome on the evening when June and Royston were murdered. These are people who do not want others to know that they were there, Detective Chief Superintendent Phillips said. I can assure them that our only interest is in solving a murder. We're not interested in their personal lives.
This was an era when any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage was taboo. It was as simple as that. You would probably get along the riverbank, rather obviously, couples who should not have been together because they were married to somebody else. But you'd also get young people. I mean, this was long, long before the days when, mummy let her daughter sleep in the spare bedroom with her boyfriend. And in those days, people's social standing was all. It really meant everything. If your secrets came out, then you were dead in the water.
Of all the potential leads, the one that obsessed the inquiry team most was the mysterious man in the blue suit.
An off-duty fireman told detectives that on the evening the children disappeared, he chatted to a man on the banks of the river, near to the spot known as Bamboo Island. Two children, almost certainly June and Royston, were seen playing nearby. The man was aged between 45 and 50. He had fair hair tinged with grey, and he was wearing a blue suit. Quite possibly, he was the last person to see the children alive.
The summer wore on with no real progress. The man in the blue suit never came forward. For the grieving parents, the agony of waiting must have been unbearable. What they needed were answers. But no answers came. Who had killed their children and why? Was it a stranger or someone they knew and had welcomed into their lives? And for the community at large, the most alarming question was, when would he or she strike again? The bodies of young June and Royston Sheasby were found in woods near the River Froome in June 1957. They had been murdered. The police investigation was stalled, but someone was to make a startling revelation that they might know who the murderer was. With the lack of an obvious motive or any material witnesses, police seized upon every development or scrap of information that became known.
To the advantage of the police in the 1950s was the lack of mobility. People often lived and worked in the towns they were born, so there's very much the possibility that the killer is close to hand.
In the vast majority of cases, around 86% of cases of child abduction or child murder, the person who is responsible is somewhere in the police records. They're known to the police. The problem is that these are huge, vast databases. They are haystacks, and we're looking for a needle. Something that a psychologist might be very useful for is actually helping determine where in that database to look. So the kind of things that they're going to be looking for are aspects of the offender's behaviour. So, for example, did they destroy forensic evidence? Because these kind of things point to their criminal history, the types of offences they may have been convicted or investigated for.
By the time the inquest opened in September, police had interviewed more than 25,000 people within a 2-mile radius of the murder site, with more than 2,000 written statements. Early attention had focused on one of a nearby group of mental hospitals, where a patient had absconded after climbing out of a window and sliding down a drain pipe. But Chief Superintendent Phillips said that there was nothing on the man's record that showed any violence. Despite these reassurances, sections of the press decided there was an issue to be milked for all it was worth. Streets usually filled with the laughter of children at play were deserted, wrote the Bristol Evening World. The newspaper's leader comment was forthright. Has the time come for the people who run our mental hospitals to ask themselves an urgent question? Is too much latitude allowed in permitting subnormal patients to mix with the public? Police began the difficult and fraught process of going into the wards to question as many patients as possible, if only to rule the hospitals out of the inquiry. In circumstances that bordered on farce, dozens of patients actually confessed to the murders, and police now found themselves deploying precious time and resources on disproving the accounts. From the scraps of information that became available through public appeals, detectives built up their own picture of June and Royston's last movements. Police believed that the children were probably walking along the banks of the River Froome when the killer enticed them. The theory was that he had led them into the Grove, a steep, thickly wooded slope that leads up from the river to the railings surrounding the Bristol Mental Hospital. To the attacker, the spot was suitably remote. The nearest road was a quarter of a mile away. Even the hospital railings were a good 40 yards from the site of the killings.
You have to bury somebody somewhere where you're confident that you're not going to be found, you're not going to be disturbed. The fact that the children were buried is important. The fact that they were buried side by side, I don't know. Does that show somebody who's quite meticulous? Maybe. I think that what it really points to is somebody who has maybe planned this offence, or certainly planned the disposal of the bodies, maybe the disposal of the murder weapon, but also the location.
The jury returned to give the expected verdict of murder by a person or persons unknown. There seemed a depressing finality about the verdict. The investigation had lost momentum. The trails had gone cold. Soon the newspapers would find other horrific murders to splash across the pages. By the autumn, the murder of the babes in the wood was still an unsolved case and looked likely to remain so. 7 years passed with no further progress.
Then on August the 26th, 1964, out of a clear blue sky, came a sensational admission by a psychiatrist, Dr. Albert Hyatt Williams, who had worked with convicted prisoners on behalf of the Home Office.
Addressing the 6th International Congress of Psychotherapy in London, Dr. Hyatt Williams spoke of his work with a prisoner patient who had since died. The man serving time for a minor crime had made a confession just before he passed away. He had murdered 2 small children, a girl and a boy. Suddenly, the case of the babes in the wood was back in the headlines.
First of all, you've got Dr. Williams, who said that this basically charming prisoner had admitted to the offences. I've worked with many people who have confessed to numerous crimes. So it might be the case, as we've seen recently with the John Carr incident, who's the man in America who confessed to killing John Benet Ramsey. It just might be complete fabrication. John Carr was not even in the general vicinity when this offence took place. He couldn't have done it. But also there's a second group of false offences, and that is people who have got mental illness, they're quite genuinely disturbed, and they've formed the belief that they've done it themselves.
But the psychiatrist would give no details to identify the man or the prison where he was serving his sentence. The file on the man had closed, but the Home Office, it seems, had given Dr. Williams permission to tell just the general story for the first time.
Dr. Williams said he had actually signed the Official Secrets Act and he had been ordered to preserve anonymity and not to give any details which might lead to the identification of the prisoner. "I'm terribly anxious not to stir up any more mud over this case," said Dr. Williams. Well, anxious he might be, but I find his position astonishing. He's got this information and he chooses to reveal it to the world at large through a conference. We do know that false confessions are quite commonplace in high-profile cases, but nonetheless the police should have been able to access this information and the identification of the person who made the confession.
The political reverberations were ferocious. Politicians and public were outraged that the doctor had left the issue dangling. The prisoner, if indeed his story was true, had achieved peace of mind. For the Sheasby family, the agony continued. But the Home Office made no response, except to say that Dr. Hyatt Williams was not its employee. Bristol's Western Daily Press blazed away at the Home Secretary, Henry Brooke.
Home Secretary Henry Brooke was asked again and again yesterday, was the conscience-stricken killer the man who murdered the Bristol babes in the wood? Mr. Alan Hopkins, MP for Bristol North, asked it. The children's father asked it. All they wanted to know was why Dr. Hyatt Williams was allowed to tell a conference that a patient had admitted killing a boy and a girl.
And all they got was this statement from the Home Office. He is a consultant psychiatrist at Oakwood Hospital, Maidstone. He is called on to undertake the specialised psychiatric treatment of certain offenders. The Home Office was informed by Dr. Williams of his intention to speak at the conference, and he was reminded that if he used case material obtained in the course of his work for the Home Office, it should not enable any particular case to be identified. The Home Office did not see his script.
Bristol CID even approached Hyatt Williams, who replied, "I have spent a night with my conscience and I cannot divulge the name of the person concerned." So who killed June and Royston Sheasby?
Was it Hyatt Williams' conscience-stricken prisoner? Was it the man in the blue suit? Or were they one and the same person? Who holds the terrible secret? Is it Dr. Hyatt Williams? We believe he's still alive, but despite numerous attempts to contact him, we've only met with a brick wall.
Or is there still someone out there in old age who cannot find it within themselves to confess?
Had we had the same weapons available to us back in the 1950s. So if we'd had the statistics that we have now, and we have the vast databases that we have now, we might have stood a much better chance of actually locating who killed these children.
One thing I've learned through researching my crime novels, through talking to my police contacts and so on, and studying figures, is that the vast majority, I think it's over 90%, of child murders are actually perpetrated by somebody within the family, somebody close by, a neighbour, or at the very least somebody the children know vaguely and trust. This one, I think, is one of the few exceptions.
From a forensic point of view, again, the problems 50 years ago would be the same as today. It's the protection and integrity of the crime scene, and the fact there'd be very little information left at the scene given the fact the bodies had been exposed for 11 days. There would be a lot more science thrown at the investigation, but I suspect that the reality of it would be that the investigation would be very little different than it would have been 50 years ago.
Somebody who I do think is guilty of a crime, albeit not murder, is the consultant psychiatrist who came up with this confession from an unknown person 7 years after the event. Having many times in my life as a journalist interviewed people who've just lost a loved one in some sort of violent situation, knowing what they go through, to have this thrown in their faces 7 years later without a solution, I think is really a criminal act, because it usually does give families some closure, if they can, some sense of peace, to know what happened, to know who did it.
Even now, half a century later, is there someone keeping quiet who knows the answer to the case of the babes in the wood? And will the Sheasbys live to learn who so cruelly took their children from them?